We're really going to be looking at verses 9 through 11 for the lesson this evening. Romans 12 is, as we introduced last week, kind of the beginning of Paul's practical session when it comes to the book of Romans. In the first 11 chapters, he's primarily dwelt upon the idea of doctrine. What is it that we should be doing? What is it that God teaches us? Which is kind of the root idea of what the word doctrine means. Sometimes we sort of struggle with that. And perhaps make a little more of it than it actually is. But the word doctrine in the original language just means teaching. So what is it that God would have us know? What is it that we're doing right? What is it that we're doing, wrong? Where are the boundaries that we're supposed to stay within? That's the first 11 chapters. As Paul deals with this idea of, sin. And what they were doing wrong in the Gentile world, what they were doing wrong in the Jewish world, and how it was that they could come out of that sin that plagues us, that causes us all kinds of difficulty. Chapter 12 is kind of the practical hands-on section, or at least the beginning of the practical sort of hands-on section of the book of Romans. And from here on out, we're going to really be focusing on a lot of practical matters to just basically daily Christian living. How is it that we're supposed to live? I mean, what does the Christian life look like? On a rubber meets the road sort of level, in close examination, what are the actions we should be engaging in each and every day? Well, you and I both know that life is not always what we expect it to be. Not long ago, I was reading a story about a man who owned an apartment complex, and he was doing some brickwork on the second floor of this apartment complex. And he overestimated the amount of bricks that he needed. And there he was, having the work completed on top of this scaffolding with all of these bricks. And he wondered, how am I going to get these down? And instead of going up and down and carrying them one by one, he had this genius idea. As he looked out over the lay of the land, he saw there this 55-gallon, barrel that was there. And he thought, if I can just tie that barrel, to the rope that I have, I can run that rope over this tree that is nearby, and then once I have the barrel loaded up, I can just pull the rope, let the barrel down, so on and so forth. One fell swoop, I get it all. Well, the story goes on to talk about how the man put all the bricks in the barrel, having tied the rope off to the tree. So here's this barrel suspended in midair, tied to a rope, which is tied to this tree. And so he gets it all full of the bricks, and he goes down, and he stands next to the rope, and without even giving it much thought, putting the rope kind of around his arm, he undoes the rope. Now, as you might imagine, a 55-gallon drum full of bricks is probably going to weigh more than that guy does. So with the rope tied around his arm, he unloosens the knot, and sure enough, he takes off like a rocket. Takes off like a rocket, goes up, hits his head on the branch, falls down, lands on the scaffolding, plummets to the ground before the barrel can actually get there. Ends up having the barrel land on his legs. The bottom of the barrel breaks off. The bricks come pouring out. So here he is. Hit the tree, hit the scaffolding, and the bricks hit him. It's an interesting story. It was kind of humorous, and it was written to be humorous. But isn't that the way life is at times? We've got these really cool ideas, and we look at the survey of the land, and we make our decisions, and lo and behold, we made all the wrong ones. And it kind of beats us up. And it kind of puts us through the ringer. Maybe not always in a physical sense, sometimes in an emotional sense. Or sometimes in our relationships. We're kind of put to the test over and over and over, and we get bumped and bruised. Well, Paul, I think in this section, gives us some really good advice for how it is we can go right when everything starts to go wrong. How do we get back on track? And I think the things that Paul tells us here in Romans 12 really works down from verse 9 all the way really to the end of the chapter, but but I didn't have time to hit all of them, so I figured verses 9 through 11. Paul gives us a few things that if we remember these things, even when the bumps and the bruises, and even when the path deviates and we find ourselves in places that aren't exactly friendly, we can find our way back. We can get back on the right track. In other words, to put it kind of in the simplest form that I can, these are things that will never be wrong. It doesn't matter what situation that you are in. Paul says these are the things that make up the core of not just your identity, but they make up the core of the behavior that you should be exhibiting as a child of God. The first thing that he mentions here, well, I'll tell you what, let's just read verses 9 through 11, and we'll go back and we'll pick them up one by one. He says, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord." Now again, like he goes on and he gives some really wonderful advice in the verses that follow, but man, look at all that Paul says in these verses. There are at least 4 things that Paul mentions here that if we make them kind of our core behavior, it not only minimizes the possibility of us actually going wrong, but even when we do go wrong, these are the things that are going to kind of fix us back to what is right and to get us back on course. The first one he says is love sincerely. Love sincerely. Now, there's a big difference, would you say, between love and sincere love? I mean, people say, I love you, right? But the same people who say that they love you will tell, their buddy that, oh man, they really love that burger. They really love that pizza, or they, really like going out fishing and, really love going out fishing. So I mean, in a modern day setting, love is a word without nuance. And we can use it for pretty much, anything. Pretty much anything. But here, Paul gets really, really specific. Really, really specific. And he says, let love be genuine. Love in and of itself is a sacrifice. The very definition of this particular word, love, means self-sacrificing benevolence. It means that you're giving yourself up so that the love, or that the object of your affection can actually benefit. It's not a love that is offered because of what somebody does, but it is a love that is offered because of who you are. In other words, this is a love that is offered by choice. By choice. So, it's that agape form of love. It's the same love that is used when the Bible tells us that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. It's that love, right? But he says, look, let that be genuine. Let that be genuine, which kind of tells us something, does it not? It tells us that even that particular kind of love can be offered in kind of a false way. It can be offered maybe under false pretenses. It can be offered in an insincere fashion. Really, when you boil it all down to it, Christ would say, if you love me, keep my commandments. Now, is it possible to keep his commandments and not have a genuine love? Sure it is. What do we call that? We call that going through the motions, right? Some would call that, Phariseeism. Or, I don't know, I was about ready to make up a word there. But, you're going to look a lot like the Pharisees, who kind of went about doing all of these things, but they weren't really doing it out of love. The Bible seems to indicate, Christ seems to indicate, that they were doing it more so that people could see them. They were doing it more so that they could keep their chief seats in the temple. Theirs was not a genuine love. As a matter of fact, describing that era and the era that would come after it, there are statements that kind of sound like this. Predictions by Jesus Christ. He would say things like, in those days, the love of many will what? Grow cold, right? Grow cold. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to continue to do some of these things. Couple that with the teaching about, wolves in sheep's clothing. On the surface, they look good. But their love has grown cold, and they've become the worst enemy that you can imagine. See, it is possible to not love with a genuine sense of love. It is possible to love and not be in your heart convicted about the things that God tells us, about the relationship that we have with him. If you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it's the great love chapter of the Bible, or at least one of two great love chapters of the New Testament. In verses 4 through 7, Paul says this. He says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And those are some powerful statements. In defining what this love is and isn't, we really have this structure that Paul presents here of what it means to genuinely love. I mean, is our love boastful? Does our love envy? Is our love prideful? Is our love all those things Paul says they shouldn't be? Or do we include those things Paul says to include in our idea of love? I think anything that falls short of this idea is going to be a love that is not offered with the fullness of our heart. And therefore, we've got to wonder about, the sincerity with which it is offered. Now, don't get me wrong. I think everybody grows to this kind of love. You just don't all of a sudden one day wake up and, ooh, there you are. We have this really deepened sense of what it means to actually, love God and to love our brothers and sisters in Christ. I think it's something that we grow, into. When Paul wrote those words in 1 Corinthians 13, I think he knew and understood that this is something that is developed over time. Peter said it this way in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8. He says, above all, love each other deeply. And do you remember why he says that? There's that famous line, because love what? Covers a multitude of sins. Man, when people lose their way, when life intervenes and things don't go the way that we want them to go, love has this ability to get us back on the right track. When we show people love, it can help them. And it certainly helps us to keep and stay on that right path. In John chapter 4, Jesus is talking to the woman at the well. And I don't know that the word love is really even used in the context at all. But you can see it in the context. Christ encounters this woman, and she's been married how many times? 5 times. And she is now living with the guy who's not her husband, so he's guy number 6. He's guy number 6, and they're not even married. They're, just living together, right? So they go through this conversation, and Christ is asking her all of these questions, and you'll notice just how loving he is with her. And you got to wonder, put yourself in those shoes. And ask yourself that question. Would you treat that woman the same way that Jesus did? 5 guys. You've been married, how many times have you been married? I don't know, I think we would tend to get a little judgmental. Now, I'm not going to assess you. I'll assess me. I would tend to think that I would look at that and I would say, 1 time, 2 times, maybe 3 times, 5 times. And now you're doing the wrong thing with the guy you're currently with? Come on. And I would be really tempted to not be loving. But you'll notice, Christ doesn't treat her poorly. He just slowly, through the course of conversation, leads her back home to where she needs to be. It's amazing context. But it demonstrates for us the love of God. And truly, for God did so love the world that he gave his son. And his son came here and he taught us how to love. Second thing that he mentions, Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Hold fast to what is good. Second point, cling constantly to good things. Okay? Love genuinely. Cling to the things in life that are good. Man, we have so many people who are dwelling on the bad, right? You can turn on any news outlet, you can pick up any magazine, you can read the local paper, and it just seems like everywhere you go, it's all about bad, 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 bad. I mean, that's what the news industry is all about, right? I mean, there are very few publications that are devoted fully to the idea of, hey, let's share some good news. And even those who are, Christians can sometimes fall into this trap. I'll share with you this, there's a publication that we receive here on a regular basis, but you never get to see it. We never put it out. Most of the time it just hits the trash. Because when it comes, it is so caustic and so negative and so just ridiculous about the way it approaches things that it's really hardly worth reading. And it's unfortunate that some people have turned Christianity into that. All about the nitpick. All about, hey, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. Walking around telling people you're wrong. It's no wonder that some people out here in the world who've only come in contact with those type of people think, man, those Christians are just a bunch of stuck-up people living in their ivory tower. Why would I want to do that? And that's not what God had in mind. God had in mind that Christianity would be a joyous thing, would be something that focuses on the good. It's funny, if you go back to the Garden of Gethsemane, perhaps you recall the incident when they're about ready to take Jesus away. There's in the garden a guy by the name of Malchus. And Malchus has a little surgical procedure there in the garden, right? Peter rises up and draws out his sword and he cuts off his ear. And do you remember what Christ did? He healed him. He picks up the ear and he puts the ear back on. You got to wonder what that looked like. It must have been an amazing thing, right? He got it on crooked. I'm pretty sure if Jesus did it, it was on there just right, if not better than it was before. All right? But he, puts the ear back on. And every time I read that story, I wonder, what's the point of telling that story? And a lot of people, want to go there and talk about, defense and things like that. But I think one of the things that perhaps we miss in that particular context is this idea of focusing on the good. Focusing on the good. Peter's reaction was one that was very, very negative. Now, granted, what was going on was very, very negative, at least in their perception, but Christ saw the greater good. And he understood that this all had to do with a plan to bring the greatest good to humanity. And knowing that, he acted appropriately. Not caustically, not violently, but with good. And in that hour when this very man had come to drag him away, he picks his ear off the ground and puts it back on his head. That's goodness. Jude 23. Jude 23 kind of gives a picture of this as well. It says, save some by snatching them from the very flames of hell itself. And as for others, help them to find the Lord by being kind to them. But be careful that you yourselves aren't pulled along into their sins. Hate every trace of their sin while being merciful to them as sinners. Notice what he says there in the middle. He says, help them find the Lord by being kind to them. Cling to those things that are good. Cling to those things that are beneficial. I remember one time reading in one of the books about family and counseling that I have in the office about this couple. And this couple was just your average, ordinary couple. If they were walking down the street, there was nothing that would stand out about them that would make you look twice at them. And one thing that they had in common with all other, ordinary couples was that they would squabble from time to time. And of course, 15 years of that from time to time turned into kind of a regular, basis. And she had gotten used to his sarcasm, and he had gotten used to kind of her cold shoulder from time to time, until one day. One day they woke up, and they sat and they ate breakfast together. And the man looked at the woman and he said, I have this magic chest of drawers in my room. I wake up every day and somehow it's full of freshly folded socks and underwear. And I thank you for doing that for me every single day. Maybe I've never told you that before. And the wife just looked at him and said, okay, what do you want? And he said, nothing. He said, I just realized I hadn't complimented you in a while. And she let it pass. And then a couple of days went by, and they got a notice from the bank. Turns out one of the bank statements was wrong. The checkbook didn't reconcile, and it was her fault. In the past, he had always attacked her, and in this case, he looked at her and said, mistakes are mistakes, but I do appreciate you doing the bills because I can't imagine doing them myself. And again, she's waiting for the hammer to drop. Okay, what's going on? And he just said, I've learned to appreciate the things that you do for me. A couple of days later, she's at the store and she's writing the check, and she looks down at the checkbook and she double checks the numbers. And she thinks to herself in the middle of double checking the numbers, why am I double checking the numbers? He's up to something. Making me feel this way. Until one day she decided to start focusing on the good that he had in his life. And pretty soon, the good that he had focused on turned into the good that she would focus on, which turned into this great relationship. See, if you focus on the good, good things happen. Yeah, bad things will happen. Yeah, sometimes horrendous and horrific things happen. But we can still focus on those things that are good and lovely and part of what God has in mind for us as his children. The third thing that Paul says, found there in Romans chapter 12, is that we are to honor graciously. We are to honor one another graciously. Love one another with brotherly affection. Undo one another in showing honor. Outdo one another in showing honor. I love the way this is worded, because it's almost stated, of course, Paul was the, competitive athlete of the Bible. I mean, if you are the competitive athlete in your family, your home, the congregation, then, you dig Paul, because that's who he was. And this is the way he words it here. He says it's almost like a competition. You guys ought to see who is going to get the blue ribbon, who's going to get the first place trophy for honoring one another, for showing that kind of respect, putting others on in that place, I should say, of honor. Paul, in just one chapter later, is going to say this in Romans 13, verse 7. He says, give honor to whom honor is due. Now, we could name all of the people that the Bible says give honor to. We ought to honor those who are our leaders. Those men who labor diligently and struggle sometimes with those important spiritual questions. They are worthy of honor. And the Bible even says that those who are preaching and teaching and in that position are worth double honor. We ought to be holding them up. We ought to be lifting them up. It's funny. A couple weeks ago, I went up and saw my mom, and I was talking to someone about that, and they were saying, oh, you're going to go help your mom. That's just really nice of you to go out of your way and go up there and help your mom. And I thought to myself, and I didn't say anything to them, because I knew they were just trying to be complimentary. But I thought about it, and I said, it's not really a matter of niceness. It's a matter of simple appreciation of the fact that she is my mom, and she is in that place of honor, and that's the way it ought to be. You know, she gave birth to me, she nurtured me, and nourished me. She is worthy of honor, and that's the way it ought to be. That's why the Bible tells us, children, honor your parents, because that's the way it ought to be. That's the godly order of things. When we are treating one another honorably, it's going to avoid a lot of headache. Just like if we're treating one another with love, just like if we're holding on to those things that are good, man, it's going to eliminate some really big headaches. Really big headaches. We need to honor one another. Paul said it this way in Philippians chapter 2. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also the interest of others. And that's partly this whole idea of honoring people. And the final thing that Paul says is to serve zealously. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Not too long ago, and both Joshes are here this evening, but not too long ago, we went out fishing on Josh and Dad's boat. And we went out to this place that they like to call Gruntville, right? And you can catch these, they're grunts, right? The gray, like snapper things. Great eating. We caught a ton of them. Filled this cooler full of them. And man, they were excited, and I was excited. Josh and's dad was excited, and we came in, and we're snapping pictures and all of that. Do we have that same kind of zeal? Maybe you get fired up about sports. Maybe you get fired up about, I don't know what it is. Do we have that same kind of fire for God? Notice what he says here. He throws in the opposite. Don't be slothful in zeal. It's kind of interesting the way he words it. Is it possible to be slothful in zeal? Yeah, I'm a zealous sloth. That doesn't make any sense. It's almost kind of funny the way he words it. Because really, it's almost an impossibility. You know what a sloth is, right? It's that slow-moving creature that goes so slow that it grows, moss on it. Man, we can't be like that when it comes to serving, God. It ought to all be about, zeal and fervor, being on fire. Paul has to remind Timothy of this. As he writes Timothy, who's this young evangelist, he becomes discouraged, and he says, Timothy, you need to fan into flames. Fan into flames that gift, that fire that God placed within you to do his will and be a good minister. Everybody gets discouraged. Everybody gets down. But we can't stay there. We've got to constantly seek this zeal. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 says, each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. See, God has given us these gifts, and he expects us to embrace these gifts. Now, yours is different than the person next to you, and theirs is different than the person next to them, and theirs is different than mine, and so on and so forth. So your zeal may look a little different than my zeal does, but we ought to have this zeal and faithfully administer God's grace in its various forms. All of these things, I think. And you could go on. We could talk about rejoicing in hope. We could talk about being patient in tribulation. And here's one that we've been looking at on Sunday mornings, constant in prayer. Keep reading the context. And these are the things that will moor us to proper Christian living. So when everything goes wrong, you can get back to what is right. Well, maybe you're here tonight, and that's the exact position that you're in. Maybe things have gone wrong, and you need to get back to what is right. Or maybe you're here and you've never really got connected to that which is right. You've never entered into a relationship with God. Hear his word this evening. Faith comes by hearing. And we know that without faith, it is impossible to please him. You've got to have that strength of conviction. But it's got to be a conviction about something. So we begin by hearing his word. Having that strength of conviction, so strong, in fact, that it leads us to want to actually change our mind about a few things. I used to walk this way, but now I'm going to walk this way. I'm going to change the person I am from the inside out. Confess the name of Christ, that he is the Son of the living God, and enter into the waters of baptism, being immersed, so you can rise from that watery grave to walk in newness of life. If you're here tonight and you're subject to the invitation's call in any way, we encourage you to come as we stand and sing.